Well, I come from an outsider's perspective in a couple ways. I teach physics, and I do so at the college level. So I'm not going to try to pretend that I know exactly how what I say will apply to your lives as teachers and librarians, but I suspect that it will. I suspect there will be themes in here that make sense to you, and I hope that that will filter through as we talk about it. One of the things that I think we've learned about humans recently that I think is really interesting is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And this is a pretty fascinating thing. And basically, the way it's usually portrayed in these snarky online social media circles is when you're incompetent, you can't tell that you're incompetent because you lack the expertise to judge what's competent. But the flip side of that is that when you're an expert in a field, you will tend to underestimate what you know because you're aware of the huge amount in that field you don't know. So we get the two sides of this coin, and especially in higher education teaching, I would say that my expertise in physics makes me underestimate how much physics I know compared to most people. But the fact that I was never particularly taught how to teach means that I am likely to overestimate how good of a teacher I am compared to the average person. And that seems like a really bad thing. Because if you're engaged with people, especially as a teacher, that's a fundamentally social activity. And so my expertise in physics doesn't necessarily help me a whole lot to be a good teacher. There's a whole lot more going on there. And the analogy I would make would be a medical one, that I really need my surgeon to know their medical science. That's what's going to make them a good surgeon. And so I really need teachers to know the science of teaching, what goes on, what makes good teaching work, and what's the evidence behind it. It's not okay with me if they teach the way they were taught. Because it's not okay with me that the surgeons just pass things down for 30 years, right? If my surgeon just does surgery the way he got surgery when he was 5, and we go back another generation before that, that just gives us surgery handed down from the 1700s or earlier, which is not what we want. We want surgeons who are aware of the best evidence we have about what's a good idea and what's a bad idea. Should you cut that part right there or not? I really want them to know before they do anything. Not like, well, the guy that did mine 30 years ago cut that part. No, that's totally unacceptable to me as the criteria that you're going to use. So what I'm trying to say is that I think we should all be social scientists in that we engage in a primarily social activity of trying in some way to help others learn about the universe that we live in. So the way I describe this is scholarly teaching, and I can describe it in sort of two goals. I want to apply the rigor and scholarship of whatever our academic discipline is to the discipline of teaching itself. There should be just as much rigor, just as much understanding about the intricacies of teaching as you might have about, in my case, physics or social studies or teaching with primary sources, things like that. Number two, I want you to choose teaching methods that are strongly informed by the best empirical evidence. This is not an insistence that we all do the science. I don't need my doctor to be the one who does the randomized controlled blind studies on this particular medication. I just want them to know what the results of that studies show, right? So I want you to be informed by that as you go forward and try to do this social activity of teaching. So in the brief amount of time that I have to talk to you about it today, I want to talk about 3 pretty consistent sort of evidence-based results that we get from this. So one is that class time is best spent doing actively engaging things with learners. That, by contrast, straight lecture, like what I'm doing right now, is comparatively less effective, or rather, it should be in snippets when the people that are involved have a whole lot of background already and they are ready to learn things. It shouldn't be the primary mode of delivery. Effective preparation is really important. We need both the learners in the room and the teachers in the room to be prepared in important ways for their interaction with each other and with the material. And that feedback loops and iteration are a really, really key part of learning that we often ignore, and maybe we don't have to anymore due to the advent of certain kinds of technology. So I want to talk very briefly about these 3 ideas before I don't keep you past the lunch bell, I hope. So when I talk to college faculty, one of the things I like to ask them is, consider a typical day in a college class. What fraction of students did their preparatory work before coming to class. And if you went to college, you can think about your experience in this, or if you work in a college setting now, you can think about your experience. And if I had a longer time, I would have given you all clickers and asked your opinion, but I don't have that time. So here's the information. Whoops. Here's the previous information that I've gotten from anonymous polling results from, this is about 230 faculty that I've spoken to at various points. And that's what the curve looks like. Actually, this data includes some administrators and some students. Administrators being the most optimistic of the groups. Students and faculty tend to agree pretty much about how many of them do the preparatory work, so at least we're not totally ignorant on that front, but administrators think it's a little higher. This lines up pretty well with the actual research. We've studied this question, and the answer is usually about a third. That if you say, please read this before next time, or please watch this, or whatever it is, typically you'll get about 1/3 of the students that do that on an average day. That's probably what I did when I was a student. Actually, that might be a little high. I'm not sure I read that often. Mostly because the feedback loop was I didn't do the reading, and I felt guilty, and I went to class, and I felt guilty. And then the teacher pretty much told me whatever was in the reading, and I kind of got it. And so I left feeling slightly guilty, but also like, that pretty much worked. Right? So I can feel a little bit guilty every day and have an extra couple hours of time every day. That's okay, I'm all right with that. That was a fine trade-off, right? That's the basic incentives we tend to offer our students. So from my perspective, this is incredibly low-hanging fruit. No matter what you do with students in the classroom, it's going to be enhanced if they have context for what's going to happen, if they've learned the easy little bits like definitions and basic words prior to showing up to class. Any of that kind of thing that can be learned outside of the classroom should be learned outside of the classroom before we talk about it in class. There's no reason for them to spend time, or in the college classroom, a lot of money for me to tell them what they could learn by watching a YouTube video or by reading a chapter or something like that. Here's another perspective on this, or another slice of this. Consider a typical day in a typical college class. What fraction of class time is spent on lecture-based delivery of content? And this is a fascinating discussion, and if you want to come talk over lunch, I put my name on a spot out there. Here's what the responses I've gotten from other people in the past. I don't actually know exactly any scholarly data on this. It's probably out there, but this gets a little touchy, right? This is personal. What are you doing in the classroom when you talk to a teacher? But you can see where the averages land pretty solidly toward the high end. And I can't guarantee that this is a good thing or a bad thing. What I want to make sure is that if your classroom, if I was talking to a teacher or whatever, if your classroom is at 70%, you chose 70% for a good reason. So if you chose 70% of your class time to be lecture-based delivery of content because you know that that's the best way to teach this topic, awesome. I'm totally happy with that answer. I really doubt that's the reason for the vast majority of these numbers. So that makes me more nervous. That makes me want you to say to you, go back, try and find out what the actual most effective way is, not the traditional way, not the easy way, not necessarily the one you're comfortable with, but what works? What do we know about what actually works? It's also fair to say that the things that you can get across through straight lecture are exactly the kinds of things that you can get people to learn outside of the classroom, generally speaking. I mean, I enjoy being in a room with you right now, but at least to a large extent, you could get a lot of what I have to say right now if I made a YouTube video. Then we would face some challenges about what kind of incentives would I have to offer to get you to watch it, right? But if you watched it, you'd get most of what I have to say today. There's a slightly added layer with being in the room, and I get little social cues, and I get to tell if you like the jokes or not, right? Those kinds of things. But for the most part, the stuff that I'm delivering to you today is not necessarily something that really should be spent this way. If you're going to pay a ton of money to spend time with me, I should do other things with you than this. Same thing happens in the classroom. So lastly, let's talk about feedback loops. There are clearly lots of situations where humans like to learn. So you may really enjoy learning a musical instrument, for example, or depending on how old you are, one of these two may or may not connect with you. Learning how to master oops, we went a little bit too far, learning how to master one video game or another. This one is a musical video game, so that brings two of them together. But we will spend hours and hours pouring practice time into these kinds of things because they have been developed to be really, really engaging and enjoyable. You get to achieve mastery. You get, I mean, there's all the kinds of things that motivate people are present in these. That's what makes them fun. That's why we do them over and over. They motivate us to come back to them. Even something like shooting hoops outside can be very motivating. And so here's the common themes that I see in those kinds of examples. You get really quick feedback. And the feedback doesn't cost you anything, especially if because the feedback is usually, that didn't work, right? That's basic. That's the basic feedback in most video games. Nope. Try something else, right? So failure is expected. Failure is desired. We want you to fail so you can try again and try something new. The cost of failure is extremely low. And it's clear, everybody understands from the get-go that learning requires iteration. There's no sense, I've never really enjoyed arcades, having grown up with video game systems that I could play at home. Because at the arcade, if you play and then you die, you have to pay another quarter. And I want the freedom to try this, and if I die, go back and try again without having to pay more money, right? So I don't know, that was always a little bit of a break for me. And so I want it to be clear. Well, we do that to our students all the time, right? You come in, we talk for 5 weeks, and then I give you a test. Did it go well? Oh, well, you can't try again. That's not how it works. So if we think about the typical feedback loops in many learning situations, certainly in classrooms, especially in college. So when I took introductory physics, I turned in a paper homework once a week. I'd been working on it for nominally a week, if I was an exceptionally diligent student. And then a week after handing it in, if my professor was particularly diligent, I got something back that had some feedback. So potentially, a question that I had worked on 10 days ago, I have now gotten my first bit of feedback on it. I thought I nailed it. Turned out I totally blew it. It's taken 10 days for me to find that out. That's the kind of thing that we just don't have to do anymore. There are ways, online homework systems, one of their really powerful strengths is instantaneous feedback. Lots of students at first really don't like that because all of a sudden they feel like they have to keep working instead of quitting and going to bed. Right? So when I talk to my students about online homework systems, one of the things I say to them is you're going to spend more time on homework because when it comes back and says no, you're going to be compelled to try again and try something new. And that wouldn't happen if you were doing something on paper and you finished, you would be like, all right, in 10 days I'll find out and by then I won't really care. If we put all of these together, there's some really compelling evidence about how powerful this can be. So there's an article from 2011 in Nature, and here's a quote from it. This is not a quote from it, this is a summary of it. Novice teachers, using evidence-based teaching techniques, more than doubled the student learning compared to an experienced, highly rated traditional instructor. So this is a situation in which techniques completely trumped highly rated but traditional teachers. The effect size, which is a statistical measure of how much of a difference some kind of intervention is making, was 2.5, and here is a quote from the paper. Other science engineering classroom studies report effect sizes less than 1. An effect size of 2 obtained with trained personal tutors is claimed to be the largest observed for any educational intervention. This study comes from large, over 100 student introductory physics classrooms. So in a situation where you would expect there's really nothing we can do that would approach the level of a trained personal tutor, we're seeing effect sizes that are larger than that for the intervention. So there's a lot of evidence out there about how we learn and what's the most effective way to learn. And whatever it is that you do that involves student learning, I suspect there's a lot of evidence out there about what you do with them as well. And I would very much encourage you to explore that and poke at that and try and find out if the reason you're doing things is well based in evidence. Do you do it that way because that's how it's always been done? Do we do it that way because that's what Socrates said? He said, sit them all in a room and yell at them and maybe occasionally let one of them talk back to you. something like that. All right, so thanks very much. I don't think I kept you past the lunch bell. If you want to get in touch or anything like that, I appreciate your time very much.